The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. Patrolman Harris had been on the evening shift for years, and tonight he was looking for an easy target. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, lingering on anyone who seemed out of place. That's when he spotted Marcus Williams, a calm, middle-aged black man standing near the corner, waiting for his ride. Harris felt a twinge of irritation, a mixture of boredom and unchecked authority. In his mind, Marcus was the perfect mark, quiet, composed, and completely unaware of the storm about to descend. Harris parked his cruiser a few feet away, engine idling, and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the dimming light. "Evening, sir," he said, voice sharp but practiced. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Marcus looked up, eyes steady and unflinching. "Waiting for a friend," he replied calmly. No hesitation, no nervous glance, just straightforward honesty. But Harris didn't want honesty. He wanted control. Fabricating a charge would be simple, a minor violation, a pretext for detainment. He had done it before, and he assumed he could do it again without consequence. "License and registration," he demanded, leaning on the cruiser, a smirk playing on his lips. Marcus complied without argument, handing over the documents with precise care. Every step was deliberate. Harris was in full control, or so he thought. Unbeknownst to him, undercover Department of Justice agents had been monitoring the neighborhood, tracking complaints about excessive stops in the area. Their cameras captured every flicker of the patrolman's arrogance, every unlawful maneuver, and every dismissive word he threw toward Marcus. What Harris saw as routine policing was being recorded in full, stored as evidence that would soon unravel his career. Marcus remained composed, but a quiet tension hummed beneath the surface. He sensed the officer's hostility, but he also sensed the invisible eyes watching. He knew that in moments like this, patience and poise could be stronger than any accusation. Harris, meanwhile, misread the calm as weakness, unaware that the balance of power was shifting even as he spoke. As the patrolman scribbled in his notebook, fabricating a pretext for arrest, Marcus's mind stayed clear. Each word, each gesture, each fabricated claim only tightened the invisible net around Harris. The street, empty except for the occasional passing car, became a stage for a silent confrontation, a battle of authority versus truth, arrogance versus patience, and ignorance versus vigilance. Tonight, a single stop would mark the beginning of a chain reaction, one that would expose corruption, reveal courage, and set into motion events no one could have predicted. Marcus didn't yet know the full scope, but one thing was certain. Harris's overconfidence was the first mistake in a long series of errors that would eventually catch up with him. The night air was thick with tension as Harris returned to his cruiser, muttering under his breath. The pretext he had created, a supposed minor traffic violation, was flimsy at best, but he wore his confidence like armor. Marcus Williams remained calm, his posture unshaken, as if he could sense the officer's desperation beneath the surface. Every measured step Marcus took was a quiet defiance, a subtle challenge to the patrolman's inflated authority. Harris radioed in a vague report, embellishing details to make the stop appear legitimate. "Possible, suspicious individual," he said, voice clipped. Inside, he was already imagining the headlines of his own efficiency, never considering that these words could one day be replayed, dissected, and used against him. He didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible whir of surveillance equipment hidden in the nearby streetlights, the DOJ's cameras silently recording every move, every inflection of his voice. Marcus, meanwhile, stayed composed. He kept his hands visible, his eyes locked on the patrolman, projecting a calm that contrasted sharply with Harris's growing impatience. It wasn't fear that kept Marcus steady. It was awareness. He knew that escalation played directly into the hands of those who abused power. Every tactic Harris attempted to provoke him only served as evidence, quietly gathering in the shadows. Harris, growing frustrated with the lack of reaction, decided to escalate. "You're coming with me," he barked, trying to assert dominance. "I said give me your ID and come along." Marcus's calm response was measured, almost surgical. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm happy to answer your questions, but I have not violated any law." His voice was steady, firm, and unshakable. This exchange, though quiet, was a pivotal moment. Harris's anger began to cloud his judgment. He started inventing small details, minor infractions, supposed suspicious behavior, each word building a fabricated case. In his mind, this was routine enforcement, a simple stop that would end with Marcus leaving shaken, intimidated, and unaware that he had done nothing wrong. But Harris's arrogance blinded him. He didn't realize that his every word, every fabricated claim, was being catalogued, time-stamped, and saved. The DOJ agents had a complete record of his abuse of authority, hidden yet omnipresent, waiting for the perfect moment to act. They were silent observers of his growing recklessness, documenting patterns, tone, and attitude that would later expose the depths of his misconduct. Marcus watched the patrolman's descent into overconfidence, recognizing the fragility behind the bravado. This wasn't just about a single stop anymore. It was a test of patience, poise, and resilience. Marcus understood the stakes. One wrong move could escalate the situation, but every calm response he offered was another brick in the foundation of accountability that would soon crush Harris's illusions of power. The night held its breath as two very different forces collided on that empty street: the unchecked authority of a corrupt officer and the quiet strength of a man who knew the truth. And unbeknownst to Harris, the silent witnesses hidden in plain sight were already preparing to ensure that justice would not be denied. The night had deepened, and the streetlights cast a cold, yellow glow across the empty pavement. Harris, now fully convinced of his authority, tightened his grip on the patrol cruiser door and glared at Marcus. Each second that Marcus remained calm fueled Harris's frustration, a dangerous mix of ego and overconfidence that was about to make him reckless. Marcus's mind was clear. He understood the dynamics at play. Harris wanted a reaction, an excuse to justify a fabricated arrest. Marcus would not give him one. His calm exterior was a shield, protecting him from the officer's aggression, while the silent witnesses' DOJ agents continued their observation. Every word Marcus spoke, every subtle movement he made, was being captured, catalogued, and time-stamped. They were invisible, yet omnipresent, documenting the unfolding abuse of power that Harris thought no one could see. Harris leaned closer, lowering his voice in a forced attempt at intimidation. "I don't have time for games, sir. You're coming with me, whether you like it or not." The tone was sharp, clipped, and filled with authority, but underneath, it carried the tremors of insecurity. Marcus remained composed, his hands visible, his stance unwavering. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm willing to cooperate, but I will not be falsely accused." The clarity and confidence in his voice seemed only to irritate Harris further. In the nearby streetlights, the hidden cameras captured the patrolman's every move, the subtle smirk that betrayed his arrogance, the fabricated notes scribbled in his log, and the way he tried to mask uncertainty behind aggression. The DOJ agents, watching remotely, could already see a pattern emerging. Harris was not just enforcing the law, he was abusing it, and in his overconfidence, he was leaving a trail of evidence that would soon become impossible to ignore. Marcus noticed Harris's shifting body language, the tightening jaw, the flick of the wrist, the way the officer's eyes darted nervously. Harris was improvising, trying to construct a story on the fly, unaware that Marcus's calm was undermining every false accusation. The quiet power of restraint was stronger than Harris's manufactured authority. A car passed slowly in the distance, headlights briefly illuminating the two men on the deserted street. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. This encounter, seemingly ordinary to any passerby, was anything but. It was a test of patience, of control, and of the consequences of unchecked power. Harris, sensing that Marcus was not intimidated, decided to push harder. "You think staying calm will save you? It won't." Marcus responded with measured words, his voice steady. "It's not calm that saves me, it's truth. And truth doesn't fear exposure." The patrolman's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus for weakness, but finding none. The silent witnesses, though, were already moving, coordinating in the background, their cameras recording every infraction. Harris's arrogance was building a case against himself, brick by brick, while Marcus maintained his composure, ready for the moment when justice would no longer be silent. In that quiet street, under the indifferent glow of streetlights, the battle was not just visible, it was being documented, destined to expose corruption in its purest form. The tension on the street had reached a boiling point. Harris, frustrated that his attempts to intimidate Marcus were failing, decided it was time to escalate further. He had spent years leaning on authority, fabricating minor infractions to assert control, and now he believed the night's events demanded a decisive action. "You're under arrest," he barked, his voice sharp and final, "for resisting and obstruction." Marcus froze for a moment, not out of fear, but to ensure clarity. He knew what Harris was doing, constructing a false narrative to justify his own overreach. "Officer, I haven't resisted anything. I haven't obstructed. This is a misunderstanding," Marcus replied calmly, his tone deliberate and measured. Every word he spoke was precise, designed to expose the absurdity of Harris's claims without giving the officer an excuse to escalate physically. Harris scribbled furiously in his notebook, fabricating details that did not exist. Every line he wrote, every word he muttered under his breath, was being silently documented by the hidden DOJ agents. They had anticipated this kind of behavior, officers abusing minor stops to flex power, but even they were impressed by the audacity Harris displayed. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that he was constructing his own downfall. Marcus noticed the tension building in Harris's shoulders, the twitch in his jaw, and the way his eyes darted nervously to the darkened street corners, almost as if he suspected unseen witnesses. Marcus didn't flinch. He maintained eye contact, projecting a quiet authority born from experience and integrity. It was a subtle battle of will's power versus principle, intimidation versus composure. As Harris attempted to cuff Marcus, the man remained still, compliant in posture but resolute in stance. The officer's actions were aggressive, unnecessary, and now being caught in full view by cameras no one could see. Every false claim resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, obstruction was already recorded, time-stamped and logged by DOJ operatives watching remotely. The patrolman's overconfidence was building an unshakable case against himself. The night seemed to stretch on, every second amplifying the stakes. A passing car's headlights reflected off Marcus's calm face, illuminating the tension in Harris's expression. Marcus understood the stakes. One misstep could turn a legal confrontation into a dangerous physical encounter. Yet every calculated word he spoke, every unflinching gesture, reinforced that truth and patience could be more powerful than force. Harris, growing impatient and desperate to assert dominance, pressed on with fabricated claims. Marcus countered with composed clarity, pointing out inconsistencies in the officer's narrative, all while keeping his hands visible and movements deliberate. The invisible DOJ agents continued to capture the entire exchange, their presence silent but omnipresent, documenting patterns of misconduct that would ultimately hold Harris accountable. By the time the patrolman realized that Marcus's calm and logic were unraveling his fabricated story, it was already too late. Every lie, every act of intimidation had been recorded. The street, though quiet and seemingly ordinary, had become a stage for the silent collection of justice, an unstoppable force gathering against the arrogance of a man who underestimated the power of truth. The quiet street felt heavier now, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Harris's frustration was palpable, radiating in the rigid set of his shoulders and the sharp clench of his jaw. Marcus Williams stood with unshakable poise, hands visible and movements deliberate, a calm beacon against the storm of false accusations. What Harris didn't realize was that the night had other observers, hidden yet vigilant, recording every illegal maneuver, every fabrication, every subtle abuse of power. From a distance, the DOJ agents monitored the encounter, their screens capturing live footage. Their software highlighted every infraction, every misstatement, and every attempt by Harris to manipulate the law to his advantage. Each frame of the recording built a case against the patrolman, a silent but undeniable narrative of corruption and overreach. Marcus's composure, though calm and understated, was acting as a magnet for justice. Harris's temper flared as Marcus calmly repeated his denials, refusing to validate the officer's manufactured claims. "I have done nothing wrong," Marcus said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You are fabricating charges to harass me, and it is illegal." Harris's eyes narrowed, disbelief and anger flickering across his face. No one had ever spoken to him this way, certainly not someone he considered powerless. He tried to regain control by inventing additional violations, citing supposed suspicious behavior and non-existent resistance. But the more he spoke, the more his words revealed his lack of credibility. Every falsified detail was a thread being woven into a tapestry of accountability that the DOJ agents were meticulously documenting. Marcus's restraint only highlighted Harris's overreach, making it clear who held the moral and legal high ground. Nearby, the occasional passerby glanced at the scene, unaware of the deeper layers of the confrontation. To them, it was a routine stop, perhaps tense, perhaps ordinary. But the cameras captured what human eyes could not: the subtle power plays, the coercive tone in Harris's voice, the carefully orchestrated calm of Marcus, and the undeniable fact that the officer's actions were unlawful. Every blink, every gesture, every word was evidence. Harris, sensing the presence of unseen observers but unable to identify them, grew reckless. His confidence, once unwavering, began to crack under the weight of Marcus's composure and the invisible scrutiny. He attempted a final show of authority, gesturing aggressively and insisting on compliance, but Marcus refused to engage beyond legal bounds. His stance was deliberate, his calm unwavering, and it frustrated Harris further. The street became a silent battlefield. One man wielded arrogance and fabricated authority, the other wielded restraint, truth, and dignity. The DOJ agents, ever watchful, documented it all: every overreach, every false statement, every violation of procedure. By the time the night ended, Harris's overconfidence would have left him exposed, captured in clear detail, and prepared to face consequences he had never imagined. Marcus knew he was not alone. Every calm word, every measured gesture, and every legal objection strengthened the invisible chain of accountability. Harris, for all his experience, had misjudged the stakes. The night had shifted from a simple confrontation to a quiet reckoning, one that would eventually ripple far beyond the street where it began. The night had grown colder, and the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the empty pavement. Harris's patience was gone, replaced by an erratic mix of arrogance and frustration. Every attempt to force Marcus into submission had failed, and the officer's carefully constructed facade of control was beginning to crumble. Marcus stood unyielding, calm in the face of mounting hostility, fully aware that the real witnesses the DOJ agents were observing, capturing every detail. Harris's fingers drummed impatiently on his notebook as he concocted new charges, each one more desperate and fabricated than the last. Loitering, suspicious conduct, resisting arrest, you're guilty of all of it. He barked, voice sharp but unconvincing. Marcus's response was deliberate, his tone measured. Officer, there is no evidence of wrongdoing. Your accusations are baseless, and they are being documented. The subtle reference to accountability seemed to pierce the officer's ego more than any verbal rebuttal could. The DOJ agents, monitoring from a remote location, were silent but intensely focused. They had anticipated escalation, and their cameras captured Harris's every movement, every note, and every exaggerated claim. His behavior, unchecked and reckless, was being meticulously recorded. Every false accusation, every coercive gesture, and every attempt to intimidate Marcus was evidence of systemic abuse. Marcus's calm composure only made Harris's fabrications more apparent, highlighting the contrast between truth and corruption. Harris, growing desperate, gestured aggressively, attempting to assert dominance with a show of authority. "I can take you in right now," he threatened, his voice louder, trembling slightly under the weight of his own insecurity. Marcus met his gaze steadily, unshaken. "You may attempt to detain me, but it will not hide the truth. Every action you take is being recorded. Every lie is being documented. The law will hold you accountable." The street seemed to pulse with tension, each word adding weight to the confrontation. Marcus's composure was not passive, it was strategic, a deliberate demonstration of restraint in the face of overreach. Harris, blinded by pride and desperation, could not see the invisible chain of accountability tightening around him. Every false charge, every aggressive gesture, every attempt to manufacture compliance was being captured, piece by piece, for the day it would matter most. A distant car passed slowly, headlights glancing across the street, momentarily illuminating Marcus's calm expression and Harris's increasingly frantic demeanor. The scene, though outwardly mundane, had become a silent battle between authority and integrity, intimidation and truth, corruption and accountability. The DOJ agents continued their watch, noting patterns and collecting evidence, prepared for the moment when their intervention would be unavoidable. Marcus remained unwavering, projecting quiet confidence. He understood that patience and clarity were more powerful than force. Harris's overconfidence was building a trap of his own making, and the night had already begun to tilt in favor of justice. One misstep, one uncontrolled reaction from the officer, would expose him completely. The stakes had never been higher, and both men knew, consciously or unconsciously, that the confrontation was far from over. The tension on the street was now palpable. Harris's arrogance and desperation collided with Marcus's calm resilience, while unseen eyes recorded everything. The night was no longer just a test of authority. It had become the foundation for the reckoning to come. The tension on the quiet street had reached its peak. Harris's frustration had transformed into reckless aggression, his arrogance now bordering on desperation. Every fabricated accusation and forced gesture was a frantic attempt to regain control, but Marcus Williams remained steady, unwavering, and composed. Every calm word he spoke highlighted the futility of Harris's fabricated claims, and every measured movement underlined the officer's growing instability. Harris, blinded by ego, had stopped noticing the subtle shifts in the environment. Passersby, though unaware of the full context, began to slow down, curious at the intensity of the confrontation. To them, it appeared as a standard police interaction, but the reality was far more charged. The silent watchers, the DOJ agents, were documenting every nuance, every word, every gesture, every fabricated claim was being recorded in high-definition detail. "I've had enough of your excuses," Harris shouted, his voice cracking with barely contained anger. He attempted to grab Marcus's arm to force compliance, but Marcus stepped back gracefully, keeping both hands visible. "Officer, your actions are unlawful. You are abusing your authority. Any physical escalation will only further implicate you, Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. The quiet power behind the words was unmistakable, and even some onlookers began to sense the injustice. Harris's mind raced. His overconfidence had convinced him that Marcus would break, that a show of force would assert dominance. Instead, every attempt to intimidate only exposed the cracks in his facade. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, inventing new details to justify an arrest that had no legal basis. But the more he wrote, the more the DOJ agents' cameras captured the fabricated story was building its own undeniable trail of evidence against him. Marcus remained composed, watching Harris flail in frustration. He understood the subtle power of restraint. His calm was a strategic shield. Every overreaction from Harris added to the growing dossier of misconduct, and Marcus's steady demeanor ensured that the officer's arrogance would be fully exposed when the time came. The street had transformed from a simple scene of confrontation into a stage of accountability. Suddenly, Harris made a critical misstep. In a surge of anger, he stepped too close, raising his voice and gesturing aggressively toward Marcus. The DOJ cameras captured it all: the overreach, the unnecessary intimidation, the escalation without cause. Marcus, without reacting aggressively, noted the violation silently, knowing that it was precisely the evidence needed to ensure accountability. The first real crack in Harris's confidence appeared. He realized too late that his unchecked authority had been systematically undermined by calm resistance and invisible oversight. Marcus's composed clarity contrasted sharply with Harris's escalating panic, creating an undeniable tension that foreshadowed the unraveling of the officer's control. The street was no longer silent. The night had shifted, marked by the silent observer's careful documentation. Harris, for all his experience and arrogance, had unknowingly set the stage for his own exposure. Marcus's resilience had turned what could have been a routine harassment into a turning point, one that would inevitably lead to consequences Harris could no longer avoid. By now, the street had taken on a charged atmosphere. The confrontation between Harris and Marcus Williams had become more than a personal clash. It was a public stage for accountability, whether Harris realized it or not. The patrolman's overconfidence had begun to crumble, replaced with a creeping awareness that his actions were being watched, analyzed, and recorded. The silent DOJ observers had shifted from monitoring to actively cataloging every detail, preparing for the inevitable moment of exposure. Harris, unaware of the magnitude of his miscalculation, continued to assert authority. "You're going to regret this," he spat, his voice trembling slightly with frustration. He tried again to fabricate a reason to detain Marcus, citing minor, non-existent infractions. But Marcus, composed and deliberate, countered each claim methodically, calmly pointing out the inconsistencies and emphasizing the officer's unlawful conduct. Each word Marcus spoke acted like a spotlight, illuminating the growing pattern of corruption. The DOJ agents, hidden in plain sight, were meticulous. They recorded not just Harris's words, but his tone, his gestures, and his body language. They captured the escalating frustration, the overreach, and the reckless attempts to manufacture authority. Every fabricated charge, every intimidation tactic, and every aggressive move was now undeniable evidence. This night, what began as a routine patrol stop had transformed into a comprehensive dossier documenting abuse of power. Marcus sensed the first tangible shift in Harris's demeanor. The officer's movements became hurried, less controlled, and increasingly erratic. Every failed attempt to provoke compliance left Harris more exposed. Marcus maintained his calm, subtly guiding the encounter to ensure that every infraction was fully documented. The strategy was clear. Restraint would become the silent instrument of justice, while unchecked arrogance would lay bare the officer's misconduct. A distant passerby, drawn by the tension, paused at the edge of the street. They noticed the unusually tense interaction, but could not see the invisible cameras recording every moment. Harris, unaware of the extent of surveillance, misread the observer's glance as doubt in Marcus's credibility. He lashed out verbally, escalating his accusations and gesturing aggressively. Marcus, calm and deliberate, maintained his composure, refusing to allow the officer's theatrics to provoke him. Every word, every movement, and every false claim Harris made became a piece of the puzzle. The DOJ agents, though unseen, were assembling a complete narrative, a record that could not be disputed. Marcus's composure had transformed the street into a stage for accountability, and Harris, in his arrogance, was performing the evidence of his own misconduct. The street seemed almost suspended in time. Harris's desperation and arrogance clashed with Marcus's quiet resilience. The night, previously a backdrop for routine policing, now served as the canvas for exposure and consequence. One wrong move from Harris, one escalation too many, and the chain of accountability would be triggered. Marcus's patience and the silent vigilance of the DOJ had shifted the balance of power completely. By the end of the night, what had begun as a fabricated stop had become a turning point, an irreversible shift. Harris's overreach was being recorded in meticulous detail, and Marcus's composed defiance had turned the ordinary street into a crucible of accountability. The exposure had begun, and there was no turning back. The night had grown late, but the tension on the street was far from fading. Harris, exhausted and increasingly erratic, began to realize that his usual tactics were failing. His fabricated accusations, once confident and assertive, now sounded hollow even to his own ears. Marcus Williams stood firm, unwavering, projecting calm authority as if the weight of truth itself rested on his shoulders. Every step Harris took toward coercion only added to the silent evidence being meticulously recorded by the DOJ agents. Harris's eyes flicked nervously to the shadows, sensing something he couldn't see, a presence that was both invisible and undeniable. His arrogance had convinced him that no one was watching, yet the pattern of his escalating misconduct had been captured from the very beginning. Each false charge, every aggressive gesture, every misstatement became part of an irrefutable record. Marcus's measured responses acted as a mirror, reflecting the officer's errors in stark clarity. "I've never been questioned like this," Harris muttered under his breath, frustration etching lines across his face. He tried one last show of authority, demanding that Marcus submit to an arrest that had no legal basis. "You will comply with the law," Harris barked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Marcus, calm and deliberate, shook his head. "You are the one who is violating the law. Every action you take is being recorded. Every false statement will be accounted for." The contrast between the two men was stark. Harris's aggression and desperation were palpable, while Marcus's calm composure radiated a quiet strength that could not be shaken. Each of Marcus's words, carefully chosen and steady, highlighted the officer's misconduct. Every misstep Harris made added to the weight of evidence forming against him. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was a full-fledged account of abuse, documented in detail by observers who could remain unseen but whose impact was unavoidable. As the minutes passed, Harris's attempts to regain control grew increasingly reckless. He waved his arms, gestured aggressively, and made false claims, attempting to force Marcus into compliance. Each movement, however, was meticulously captured by the DOJ cameras. Marcus, aware of the silent documentation, allowed Harris's arrogance to work against him, never responding with aggression, only clarity and quiet authority. The realization began to dawn on Harris. His overconfidence had created a trap he could not escape. The street, once an arena of control for him, had transformed into a stage where his misdeeds were laid bare. Every fabricated charge, every act of intimidation, was now tangible proof of misconduct. The consequences that had previously seemed distant were now imminent, closing in with a weight that Harris could neither ignore nor deflect. Marcus remained calm, knowing the power of patience and integrity. The night had shifted irrevocably. Harris was no longer in control. The street had become a crucible of accountability, and the silent observers had ensured that every detail of his actions would be impossible to deny. The consequences of this night were only beginning to surface, and the reckoning Harris had long avoided was now unavoidable. The night had shifted from tense confrontation to a calculated moment of reckoning. Harris, now visibly agitated and exhausted, was beginning to understand that the situation had escaped his control. His fabricated charges and aggressive maneuvers had built a record that he could no longer manipulate. Unseen but omnipresent, the DOJ agents continued their observation, cataloging every detail, every misstatement, every act of intimidation. The data collected was now enough to trigger formal intervention. Marcus Williams remained calm, his composure unbroken. He had maintained a careful balance, assertive enough to challenge Harris, but restrained enough to avoid giving him any pretext for escalation. Marcus had turned the street into a stage where truth, patience, and quiet authority stood in stark contrast to the officer's reckless overreach. Every movement Harris had made now spoke louder than words. As Harris attempted one final show of dominance, he heard the faint but distinct sound of approaching vehicles, the unmistakable tone of official intervention. The DOJ agents had coordinated with local authorities, and backup was arriving not for Marcus, but to address Harris's escalating misconduct. The officer's face paled. His arrogance began to crumble under the sudden realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. "Step aside, sir," a voice commanded from a marked DOJ vehicle as two agents approached, cameras rolling, microphones active. Harris froze, caught in the act of fabricating authority. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Marcus, still composed, observed silently as the officers calmly took control of the situation, confirming the evidence that had been collected throughout the night. Harris's frantic gestures now seemed both ridiculous and damning, a clear contrast to Marcus's unyielding calm. The agents reviewed Harris's notes, his fabricated logs, and his aggressive actions in real time. Every detail had been meticulously recorded. Timestamps, body language, verbal aggression, and the discrepancies in his story. Harris tried to speak, to justify himself, but the words faltered, revealing the extent of his desperation. The DOJ agent's silent observation had become formal scrutiny, and Harris had no defense against the evidence meticulously gathered against him. Marcus remained cooperative but firm, answering questions clearly and without hesitation. His integrity, previously a quiet shield, now became a powerful tool in the unfolding accountability process. The agents documented his statements alongside the officer's misconduct, creating a full, indisputable record of events. Harris's arrogance had blinded him to the reality. Every action had been captured, every lie exposed, every act of intimidation recorded. By the time the night reached its peak, Harris's overconfidence had been completely dismantled. The intervention was no longer subtle. It was official, undeniable, and unavoidable. Marcus's composure had ensured that the officer's misconduct would face consequences far beyond the empty street where it began. The stage had shifted entirely, from confrontation to accountability, with justice now moving from silent observation to formal action. The following morning brought a new tension, this time not on the empty street, but in the offices of the Department of Justice. Harris, exhausted and shaken from the events of the previous night, found himself under formal scrutiny. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced with a gnawing fear as he realized that every action, every fabricated accusation, and every attempt at intimidation had been meticulously documented. The officers who once feared him now held the power to determine his accountability. Marcus Williams, calm as ever, arrived at the DOJ offices to provide a clear, composed account. His statements were precise, methodical, and corroborated by the surveillance footage collected overnight. Each word he spoke highlighted Harris's misconduct, while emphasizing his own patience and restraint. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Harris, flustered and defensive, versus Marcus, poised and unshakable. Inside the offices, the investigators reviewed hours of footage, cross-referencing it with Harris's fabricated logs and statements. The evidence was undeniable. Every false charge, every aggressive gesture, and every violation of procedure was captured in detail. Harris tried to defend his actions, but the more he spoke, the clearer it became that his case was built on arrogance, not fact. The DOJ agents had turned what Harris thought would be an ordinary confrontation into a comprehensive account of misconduct. News of the incident began to ripple outward. Local law enforcement leadership, previously unaware of the full extent of Harris's actions, began internal investigations. The story, while procedural in nature, carried significant social weight. A black witness had been targeted, harassed, and falsely accused, only to remain calm while unseen justice recorded every misdeed. Public concern grew, with community leaders emphasizing accountability and transparency. Marcus, though the victim, remained focused on the legal process rather than public sentiment. His patience had been the key to ensuring the facts were presented clearly, without exaggeration or provocation. Every calm word he had spoken on the street now resonated within the walls of the DOJ, forming the backbone of the case against Harris. His integrity had transformed the encounter from a moment of potential danger into a demonstration of accountability. Harris, for the first time, truly understood the consequences of unchecked authority. His overconfidence had led to a detailed, undeniable record of corruption and abuse. Investigators noted not only the illegal actions, but the patterns of behavior, arrogance, fabrication, and reckless intimidation that defined his misconduct. The ramifications were clear: disciplinary action, potential termination, and legal consequences loomed on the horizon. By the end of the day, the situation had shifted irrevocably. Marcus's composed defiance and the DOJ's meticulous documentation had dismantled Harris's facade. What began as a routine street stop had escalated into a full reckoning, a moment of accountability that would resonate far beyond the narrow scope of a single encounter. Harris's arrogance had been his downfall, and Marcus's calm resolve had ensured that justice, silent yet precise, would prevail. The courtroom was quiet but tense, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Harris sat at the defendant's table, his confident demeanor from the street replaced by visible anxiety. Every misstep, every false accusation, and every act of intimidation from the night before was now under the scrutiny of judges, lawyers, and a jury. The evidence collected by the DOJ, the surveillance footage, timestamps, and meticulous documentation left no room for doubt. What had begun as a simple street confrontation had escalated into a full legal reckoning. Marcus Williams entered the courtroom with measured confidence. His calm from the street translated seamlessly into composed testimony. He recounted the encounter factually, detailing Harris's fabricated charges, verbal intimidation, and unlawful attempts at detainment. His words were precise, deliberate, and corroborated by the evidence. Marcus did not exaggerate. He let the facts speak for themselves, and in doing so dismantled Harris's credibility entirely. The prosecution presented the footage from the DOJ's hidden cameras, showing Harris's aggressive gestures, fabricated claims, and repeated overreach. Each clip highlighted not just one isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse. The jury watched in silence, absorbing the evidence that captured the full scope of the patrolman's misconduct. The once arrogant officer now appeared small, cornered, and defeated under the weight of undeniable proof. Witnesses from the neighborhood were called, including the passerby who had slowed to observe the tension on the street. Their statements reinforced the sequence of events, confirming Marcus's calm demeanor and Harris's escalating aggression. Even minor details, previously overlooked, became crucial in painting the full picture of abuse. The courtroom, once a neutral space, now became a stage for justice, accountability, and truth. Harris attempted to speak in his defense, but his words faltered. His fabricated logs and false accusations were discredited by the combined power of Marcus's testimony and the DOJ's comprehensive documentation. Every attempt to justify his actions collapsed under scrutiny. His overconfidence, which had driven him to escalate the encounter, had now become the cornerstone of his undoing. The judge's gavel finally called the proceedings to order. The verdict was clear. Harris had abused his authority, fabricated charges, and violated the civil rights of Marcus Williams. The legal consequences were significant, including suspension, termination from the force, and potential criminal charges for misconduct. Justice, long delayed and nearly invisible, had finally been delivered. Marcus, having remained composed throughout, left the courtroom quietly, his dignity intact. The ordeal had tested his patience, his restraint, and his courage, but in the end, truth had prevailed. Harris's arrogance had crumbled, exposed for all to see, and accountability had been achieved. What began as a single night on an ordinary street had transformed into a powerful narrative of justice, resilience, and the enduring strength of integrity. The case would serve as a reminder to all. Power misused may go unchecked for a time, but truth, documentation, and persistence will eventually prevail. Marcus's calm resolve and the silent vigilance of the DOJ had turned a moment of potential injustice into a testament to accountability.